Winter 1944. Somewhere in the American Midwest, snow rests quietly along the curb outside a small town beauty salon. The windows are fogged from the warmth inside. Electric dryers hum with a steady, mechanical calm. The smell of shampoo, clean, floral, unfamiliar, hangs in the air. A German woman pauses at the doorway. Her coat is thin, European, worn by years of rationing and repair. She hesitates, not from fear but from disbelief. Inside, women sit casually beneath chrome machines, reading magazines printed on thick paper. Their hair is washed with hot water that never runs out. Their hands are soft, uncalloused, untouched by rubble. She had crossed an ocean under guard. She had left behind cities reduced to ash, nights broken by sirens, mirrors darkened to hide from bombers. She had been told America was decadent, fragile, on the brink of collapse. Instead, she finds warmth, light, ease. A stylist gestures gently toward an empty chair. No orders, no shouting, just an invitation. As the woman lowers herself into the seat, she catches her reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, she sees her face clearly, without dust, without fear. And in that quiet moment, far from any battlefield, something inside her begins to shift. By the time German women began arriving on American soil in the later years of the war, the world they had left behind no longer resembled the one they had been promised. Germany in 1939 had marched into war with banners, speeches, and certainty. The regime spoke of destiny and endurance, of sacrifice rewarded by victory. But by 1943, the language had changed. What had once been triumph became necessity. What had been glory became survival. For women inside the Third Reich, war was not an abstract idea. It lived in kitchens without butter, in bedrooms without heat, in streets erased overnight. Allied bombing had transformed entire cities into landscapes of smoke and broken stone. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, names that once carried culture and confidence, became synonymous with firestorms and mass displacement. Ration cards governed daily life. Soap was scarce. Cosmetics disappeared almost entirely. Clothing was mended again and again, not for thrift, but because replacement was impossible. Hair salons, once symbols of normalcy and femininity, closed or operated sporadically. Hot water was unreliable. Electricity was rationed. Mirrors were often covered during air raids, both to prevent shattered glass and to extinguish reflections that might catch light. The Nazi state demanded endurance, especially from women. They were not merely civilians. They were logistical pillars, workers in factories, clerks in offices, auxiliaries in hospitals, farms and rail networks. Millions were mobilized to replace men sent to the front. Yet even as their labor expanded, their autonomy narrowed. The regime idealized womanhood while tightly controlling it. Motherhood praised, independence distrusted. Propaganda filled newspapers and radio broadcasts with assurances that Germany still held the advantage. That American society was weak, obsessed with comfort, incapable of sacrifice. The enemy was portrayed as materially rich, but morally hollow. Women absorbed these messages not necessarily because they believed them fully, but because alternatives were dangerous to voice. By 1944, the gap between words and reality had grown impossible to ignore. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, German women found themselves swept into circumstances no one had prepared them for. Some were nurses captured near collapsing fronts. Others were clerical workers attached to military units overrun during rapid advances. Still others were civilians caught in occupied zones, later transferred through processing camps. A small number arrived as part of prisoner exchanges, medical evacuations, or post-war transport arrangements that blurred the line between captivity and displacement. Their journeys were long, controlled, silent. Crossing the Atlantic was not an act of choice. It was a removal from familiarity, from language, from a collapsing homeland whose outcome was no longer in doubt. Many expected brutality. They had been warned of it for years. Stories circulated of American cruelty, racial chaos, moral decay. Even those who privately doubted the propaganda carried its residue with them. What they did not expect was order. Processing facilities in the United States were regulated, documented, and deliberately separated from the front-line violence they had known. Food was basic but consistent. Medical care was structured. Guards were instructed to avoid unnecessary hostility. The goal was containment, not revenge. Still, psychological tension remained constant. These women had grown up under a system that equated control with survival. Freedom, when offered without punishment, felt suspicious. Silence felt louder than shouting. And yet, amid this unfamiliar restraint, something else began to unsettle them. It was not kindness, not immediately. It was normalcy. American civilian life continued alongside the war in ways that were inconceivable back home. Shops were open. Lights stayed on. Goods were visible behind glass. Women walked unhurried, their appearance intact, their routines unbroken. This was not the image German women had been prepared for. The contrast was not yet personal, not yet intimate. That would come later, when the distance between two worlds narrowed from oceans and ideologies to a single chair, a single mirror, and a room filled with warmth. And it would begin not with interrogation or judgment, but with entry into a space that represented everything their war had taken away. While Germany rationed light, heat, and hope, the United States fought the same war from an entirely different position of strength. By 1944, America had become a nation operating at full industrial throttle. Shipyards ran day and night. Aircraft factories stretched across entire cities. Trains moved with relentless precision, carrying men, machines, and material toward distant fronts. Yet for civilians at home, daily life, though altered, retained a sense of continuity that was almost unimaginable in bombed Europe. Rationing existed, but it was structured and temporary. Food shortages were rare. Electricity flowed without interruption. Hot water was not a luxury. It was an expectation. The American war economy did not merely sustain survival, it projected stability. This stability expressed itself in subtle ways. Storefronts were lit. Windows were decorated. Shelves were stocked, even if some items required coupons. Magazines circulated in the millions, printed on paper that was thick, colorful, and plentiful. Music played openly. Public spaces remained intact, and among these spaces, beauty salons held a peculiar importance. In the United States, the beauty salon was not frivolous. It was cultural. A place where women gathered, talked, read, and briefly stepped outside the pressures of wartime responsibility. Hairstyles were regulated only by fashion, not by fuel shortages or bomb alerts. Curlers, dryers, shampoos. These were tools of routine, not privilege. The federal government understood the psychological value of such normalcy. Maintaining civilian morale was considered a strategic necessity. Women were encouraged to continue presenting themselves with confidence. Posters and advertisements framed personal care as patriotic, proof that American society remained unbroken. To German women arriving from a landscape of deprivation, these environments carried an almost destabilizing weight. They had been taught that American comfort was shallow, wasteful, unsustainable. Yet here it was, quiet, orderly, and enduring. No signs of collapse, no visible fear. The war felt distant, managed, contained beyond the horizon. The salons themselves were carefully regulated when foreign detainees or displaced persons were permitted entry. This was not indulgence. It was part of a broader strategy of controlled exposure. American authorities recognized that civilian contact could soften hostility, reduce resistance, and humanize an enemy long portrayed as monstrous. There were rules, no political discussion, no photography, guards nearby unobtrusive but present, stylists instructed to remain professional, polite, neutral, but neutrality in this setting was powerful. The physical environment alone told a story. Bright lighting that revealed rather than concealed. Chairs upholstered, not splintered. Floors clean. Tools sanitized. Mirrors large and uncovered. Nothing hidden. Nothing rationed. For German women, mirrors had become instruments of avoidance. Faces aged prematurely by stress. Hair cut short for practicality, not choice. Cleanliness reduced to function. Femininity subordinated to endurance. Here it was invited back, not demanded, not celebrated loudly, simply assumed. The act of sitting down in such a space required a quiet surrender, not of allegiance, but of defensiveness, to accept care without suspicion, to allow oneself to be seen without armor. This was not reeducation in the formal sense, no lectures, no slogans, no flags on the walls. It was something subtler. The realization that a society could wage total war without stripping its civilians of dignity. That strength did not always announce itself through sacrifice alone, but through preservation. And when German women crossed the threshold into these salons, they were not stepping into luxury. They were stepping into a contradiction, one that challenged years of conditioning more effectively than any interrogation room ever could. That contradiction would soon be experienced not as an idea, but as a sensation, felt through touch, sound, warmth, and the sudden shock of being treated as ordinary. And from that point, the story no longer belonged to ideology. It belonged to perspective. For the German women who entered these salons, the first reaction was not admiration. It was confusion. Their bodies responded before their minds did. Warm air against skin that had grown used to cold rooms and unheated corridors. Water running freely, not measured in minutes or buckets. The simple weight of a clean cape placed around their shoulders carried an unfamiliar comfort. Years of deprivation had trained them to conserve every sensation, to stand still, to endure. Here, endurance was unnecessary. The sounds alone were disorienting. Hair dryers hummed steadily, uninterrupted by sirens. Scissors clicked with precision, not urgency. Laughter drifted casually across the room, unguarded. No one whispered, no one looked toward the ceiling. The women sat rigid at first, hands folded, eyes forward. They did not speak unless addressed. Habits formed under surveillance were difficult to release. Even in safety, the body remembered constraint. And then there was the mirror. It revealed details long avoided. Dry skin softened by steam. Hair responding to care instead of neglect. Faces that looked younger than memory allowed. For some, the shock was deeply personal, a reminder of a self that had existed before ration lines and bomb shelters. Several accounts recorded later by social workers and Red Cross observers noted the same pattern: initial stiffness followed by visible relaxation. Shoulders lowering, breathing slowing, a quiet, almost embarrassed awareness that comfort was being allowed. No one celebrated this moment. There were no tears, no dramatic gestures. The emotional shift was subtle, but unmistakable. It was the recognition of normal life continuing elsewhere, uninterrupted. And for women whose war had erased normality entirely, that realization cut deeper than fear ever had. The United States did not design beauty salons as instruments of conquest. Yet in practice, they functioned as one. Traditional psychological warfare relies on fear, disorientation, and control. This was the opposite. It relied on exposure, on contrast, on the quiet collapse of expectation. German propaganda had insisted that American society was decadent and fragile, that its people lacked discipline. That comfort had weakened them. But the salon told a different story, one of order, efficiency, and calm abundance. There was no chaos here, no waste. Everything had a place. Tools were cleaned, appointments kept, time respected. This undermined years of ideological conditioning in minutes. Psychological reports from the period indicate that exposure to civilian normalcy often produced stronger effects than confinement. The enemy was no longer abstract. It had texture, routine, confidence without aggression. Importantly, there was no effort to humiliate, no lectures about defeat. The women were not reminded of their status. They were not asked to renounce beliefs. The absence of pressure itself became destabilizing. When an enemy does not behave as expected, the mind struggles to maintain certainty. For some women, this triggered resentment. For others, disbelief. For many, a quiet internal reckoning. If this was America at war, then what had Germany been fighting against? The realization did not arrive as a conclusion. It arrived as a doubt. And doubt, once introduced, does not require force to grow. In Nazi Germany, femininity had been both idealized and constrained. Women were praised symbolically while being stripped of choice. Their bodies were political instruments, expected to produce, endure, and obey. War accelerated this contradiction. Practicality replaced self-expression. Hair was cut short. Clothing became uniform. Beauty was framed as unnecessary, even suspicious. Survival left little room for self-perception. The American salon reintroduced a forbidden idea: care without purpose. There was no expectation tied to appearance, no ideological reward, no directive attached to looking well. A woman could be styled simply because she existed. This was deeply unsettling. For some German women, the experience produced guilt. Comfort felt like betrayal, of those still suffering, of those still fighting, of the identity forged through hardship. Others felt anger at themselves for wanting what had been denied for so long. Yet beneath these reactions was something more fragile, the reawakening of individual identity, not as a worker, not as a symbol, but as a person visible in a mirror, allowed to look back without shame. And once that door opened, it could not be closed again. Because identity, once reclaimed even briefly, reshapes how loss, defeat, and memory are understood. That realization would not remain confined to the salon chair. It would follow these women long after they stood up and walked back into the controlled world. Beyond from the American side, the scene in these salons was almost mundane. Women moved from chair to chair, styling hair, combing, curling, washing, and talking quietly. To them, the war was distant enough to allow routine, yet present enough to give each act of care purpose. Civilians had been trained to maintain normal life as a patriotic duty. Yet when German women arrived, something subtle shifted. Stylists noticed hesitation in posture, in gaze, in hands hovering over knees. Patrons in waiting chairs observed wide eyes, stiff shoulders, and the faint but unmistakable tension of someone accustomed to constant oversight. Polite curiosity replaced casual chatter. To the Americans, there was no threat. There were no armed enemies in their midst, only individuals caught in the machinery of war. Civilians recognized the power inherent in their calms. They represented a society that functioned under strain without collapsing. They were unwittingly, witnesses to psychological transformation. Accounts recorded later noted that many stylists felt a quiet responsibility. Small gestures, allowing a woman extra time under the dryer, offering her a choice of curlers, became acts of measured empowerment. Civilian normalcy itself was a form of authority, one that carried far more weight than coercion. For German women, entering the salon challenged deeply ingrained beliefs. The Third Reich had painted America as decadent, weak, and morally compromised. Every poster, every radio broadcast, every classroom lesson reinforced the idea of an enemy that would crumble under pressure. Instead, they found efficiency, order, abundance, civility. Every small act, mirrors uncovered, chairs ready, hot water running, clean towels, contradicted years of propaganda. The message of collapse and chaos was replaced by a lived reality of competence and quiet confidence. This confrontation between expectation and reality was psychologically disorienting. Propaganda had prepared them for domination or humiliation. What they encountered was neither. There was no attempt to punish, no coercion, no mockery. Just normal life, uninterrupted. The effect was cumulative. One encounter, then another. Quiet observations, small gestures, sustained over hours and days. Slowly, internal narratives began to fracture. Ideological conviction, once reinforced by fear, began to yield to lived experience. By the time they left the salon, the world had subtly shifted. Defeat had already been determined on battlefields, but here, in civilian space, it was confirmed in a personal, intimate, undeniable way. Finally, there was the unspoken moral contrast. In Germany, survival had been non-negotiable, obedience absolute. Choices were constrained by rules, fear, and rationing. In the salon, choice returned, not as an ethical directive, but as a fact of life. Which shampoo? Which hairstyle? How long to linger in warmth? How to behave? Every decision was small, yet monumental to women who had spent years following orders under duress. The very act of choosing, of being allowed to exercise preference, illuminated the moral latitude absent in their previous lives. These small freedoms reinforced awareness of power, responsibility, and humanity. The act of sitting in a chair, receiving care, making decisions without fear, became a silent form of resistance, not against captors, but against the ideology that had constrained them. The salon was, paradoxically, both refuge and revelation. Comfort and confrontation coexisted, and the psychological and emotional consequences would resonate far beyond that afternoon. The moment came not with fanfare, but with a simple gesture, a stylist guiding a German woman into a chair. The chair itself was ordinary, padded, steady, equipped with a footrest, but to her, it felt monumental. It was the first time in years that someone had invited her to sit without instruction or expectation. A small cape was draped over her shoulders, the fabric soft, clean and warm. She caught her reflection in the mirror, and for an instant, the world of rationed light, rationed warmth, and rationed self disappeared. Water ran freely, not in measured buckets, not in lukewarm trickles. Hot water flowed with abundance, washing away the grime of months and years. The smell of shampoo, lavender, citrus, vanilla, was foreign, luxurious even, yet strangely comforting. The hum of the dryer overhead became a steady heartbeat, a rhythm absent from bombed streets, sirens, and air raid warnings. Her fingers, rough from labor, brushed against towels that were soft and thick. The sensation was disarming. She had learned to endure discomfort, to suppress reaction, to survive. Yet here, endurance was unnecessary. Comfort was offered, and she could not refuse without seeming absurd. Around her, other women moved calmly. Their faces bore no marks of fear. Their conversations were light, casual, unhurried. They spoke of mundane things, shopping lists, family, recipes, things that had been stripped away in her previous world. And with each passing moment, the contrast grew sharper, almost unbearable. The stylist worked methodically, carefully brushing and curling. Each touch was precise, professional, unassuming. There was no admonition, no lesson, no expectation beyond the technical completion of a hairstyle. Yet each touch carried a weight the woman could not articulate. It was care. Simple, ordinary, sustained care. Her eyes, locked on the mirror, widened as she saw herself differently. The reflection staring back was familiar and strange. Skin that had been dry and muted regained subtle warmth. Eyes that had been shadowed by fatigue and fear seemed brighter, alert. Hair, unkempt for months or years, responded to the styling. She looked visible, real, human. A subtle tension passed through the room. Not from conflict, but from realization. The quietness of American normalcy became an instrument of revelation. No military unit could replicate this effect. No speech, no poster, no leaflet could so thoroughly challenge years of indoctrination and expectation. Even the guards stationed near the salon noticed. They recorded later the shift in posture, the hesitation, the almost imperceptible relaxations of jaw and shoulder. Notes emphasized the absence of overt emotion. It was the internal, psychological work that mattered. For many women, the climax of this experience was not a single event, but a cascade of tiny, cumulative shocks: the warmth of the water, the softness of towels, the freedom to breathe, to move, to be attended to without suspicion. This was the turning point. A moment where defeat on the battlefield, already real, became undeniably personal, internalized, and permanent. A moment that would remain long after they stepped back into the corridors of control and order. And as the session progressed, one thought persisted silently in the minds of many: the war had ended for them, not with bombs, not with surrender forms, but here, in a room of mirrors, soft brushes, and uninterrupted light. As the salon session progressed, the initial shock transformed into something deeper, more profound. The German women were not merely experiencing comfort. They were confronting the dissonance between everything they had been taught to believe and the reality surrounding them. Every detail chipped away at years of indoctrination. The steady hum of dryers became a metronome marking a life that moved forward without fear. The smell of warm shampoo, of clean towels, of polished floors became an olfactory manifesto. Life could exist, flourish even amid war, without constant sacrifice. Some women began to speak quietly, not to the stylists. Words were measured and cautious, but to themselves, tracing memories of normal life now erased. A memory of a birthday, a school recital, a hair ribbon forgotten in a basement during an air raid. The salon stirred recollections of identity, autonomy, and individuality long suppressed. It was a psychological fracture. Their conditioning had taught that comfort signaled weakness or decadence, that abundance was a moral flaw, that personal care was frivolous in a nation at war. Yet the room contradicted every precept. The normality, the order, the quiet efficiency, all underscored an inconvenient truth. The Americans had built strength without stripping away humanity. Some accounts noted tears, quiet, almost ashamed, wiped quickly on shoulders draped in soft fabric. Others recorded stiff hands slowly unclenching, shoulders lowering, breathing easing. The body itself, conditioned for tension, began to relax under the gentle, persistent insistence of care. The mirror became a portal to self-recognition. Faces that had grown hardened prematurely aged by fear, fatigue, and deprivation, reflected vulnerability, softness, and surprise. Some women avoided their reflection entirely, unwilling to face the contradiction. Others lingered, staring longer than necessary, as though attempting to reconcile two worlds, the one they had been told existed and the one they now lived in, however briefly. This was more than shock. It was an internal reckoning. For many, the defeat Germany had suffered in Europe was abstract, a series of news items, front reports, and casualty lists. Here, defeat became intimate, quiet, personal, internalized not through coercion, but through simple human experience. For the Americans observing, whether guards or civilian staff, nothing dramatic occurred. There was no shouting, no announcement. The transformation was subtle yet undeniable, a shift in posture, a change in gaze, a quiet surrender to sensation, comfort, and choice. The act of being allowed to exist normally, without scrutiny or suspicion, carried a force far stronger than any battlefield engagement. It was here, in the stillness of a salon chair, under the soft hum of dryers and the careful guidance of stylists, that ideology and expectation fractured completely. The women left not merely groomed, but changed. Not overtly victorious, but internally realigned. The war's consequences had moved beyond maps, guns, and policy. It had reached the human psyche in a place where no weapon could touch them. And as they stepped from the chair back into the hallways, back under the watchful eye of guards, back into the regulated order of detention and displacement, one thing was irrevocable. The war had altered not only their circumstances, but the perception of themselves. Their journey would continue, but nothing after this moment would ever be quite the same. Comfort, choice, and normalcy had proven more potent than propaganda, more persuasive than coercion, and far more enduring than fear. In the hours and days following their first salon experience, the effects on the German women were quietly profound. Observers, Red Cross officials, American guards and civilian social workers recorded subtle but unmistakable changes. The rigid postures, the watchful eyes, and the instinctive caution that had defined their movements began to relax ever so slightly. Small gestures, touching their hair, adjusting their sleeves, glancing more openly at surroundings, became noticeable markers of internal change. These were not acts of rebellion or overt expression. They were the tiny, almost imperceptible signs of someone reclaiming autonomy. For women who had spent years conditioned to defer, obey, and survive, the permission to exist without constant vigilance was revolutionary in itself. Letters and reports from the period describe quiet conversations among the detainees, whispered reflections about how different America seemed. They compared routines, food, water, and even the efficiency of the salon to the scarcity and disruption of their lives back home. For many, the realization that normalcy could exist while war raged elsewhere triggered a mix of disbelief, envy, and introspection. The psychological impact was further amplified by repeated exposure. Many women were permitted to return to salons over several days or weeks. Each visit reinforced the contrast between life in Germany and life in the United States, subtly undermining the mental constructs that had guided their perceptions for years. This phenomenon also extended to social dynamics within the group. Women who had been reserved or withdrawn began to engage cautiously with one another. A laugh, a shared observation, a question about a hairstyle or a color choice. These small interactions became exercises in self-expression and trust, once thought too risky or frivolous. For American staff, the transformation was both quiet and unmistakable. They did not lecture or admonish, they simply maintained order, routine, and care. In doing so, they inadvertently became agents of psychological recalibration. The experience highlighted a core truth: human resilience and identity could not be entirely suppressed. And the act of recognition, being seen, being treated with dignity, was profoundly restorative. And as the German women returned to their quarters or waiting areas after each session, they carried more than the cosmetic effects of shampoo and curlers. They carried awareness, an acute sense that their world was not fixed by fear, rationing, or propaganda. Small, intimate, and undeniably real, this awareness would shape their thoughts, choices, and understanding of the war itself. The long-term consequences of these salon encounters were subtle yet enduring. Many German women would carry the memory of warmth, light, and normalcy long after they were repatriated to Europe or resettled elsewhere. Unlike the abrupt violence of battle or the stark trauma of bombed cities, this experience was quiet, almost invisible, but it left a psychological imprint that persisted for years. For some, the salon became a benchmark against which all subsequent experiences were measured. Letters and post-war interviews reveal that women recalled the texture of towels, the weight of a cape on their shoulders, the sound of a dryer, and even the scent of soap with extraordinary clarity. These sensory memories were tied to a deeper understanding life could exist beyond deprivation, fear, and obedience. The encounters also influenced post-war social dynamics. Women who had been exposed to such unassuming care often carried themselves differently, exhibiting subtle confidence, grace, and assertiveness upon return to Germany. They engaged with their families and communities with new perspectives on femininity, autonomy, and human decency that could not be unlearned. Some historians note that these experiences contributed to a quiet, internalized challenge to Nazi ideology. While the war had ended militarily, the psychological unraveling of belief systems continued in these intimate, civilian spaces. For women who had grown up internalizing state propaganda, the experience of being treated with simple, unearned respect was revolutionary. Additionally, the salons offered a rare lens on American society. For many, the contrast between European scarcity and American abundance forced a re-evaluation of cultural and moral assumptions. They observed a society that could fight a global war without eroding the dignity of its citizens. A concept foreign to those who had lived under totalitarian austerity. Some women eventually shared these memories in memoirs or interviews decades later. Though framed modestly, the accounts consistently emphasized the power of the ordinary mirrors, chairs, warm water, and soft towels had conveyed more than any political discourse ever could. The war had been experienced not just on battlefields, but in spaces where humanity quietly persisted. And in these recollections, there is a common thread: the understanding that defeat and transformation can occur as much in the mind and spirit as in armies and nations. The salon, with its hum of dryers and gentle touch of stylists, had become a site of personal and ideological revelation, bridging two worlds in a way no battle ever could.